Now it's time for today's perspective. And just 2 months ago, the US said it was cutting $50 million worth of medical aid a year to Zambia because of what it called the systematic theft of the aid in the past years. The cut's just part, of course, of a huge international slew of cuts to USAID that have hit countries right across the planet. And now, of course, those decisions are really starting to have a huge impact on the ground. ActionAid says the cuts are exacerbating several huge problems, including one example for you of women having to offer sex to men in order for them to rent boats to go out and fish to provide food for their families. Well, right now, the UN Conference on Financing and Development has opened in the Spanish city of Seville as how to deal with the cuts to USAID really tops the agenda. Well, joining me from that conference in Seville is Country Director of ActionAid Zambia, Faides TembaTemba. Thanks very much for joining us on the programme today. Let's start off by talking about that one example I just mentioned to give people an idea of what these cuts mean. That USAID project being cut that supported women fishers has been disrupted, resulting in an awful lot of challenges. Explain to us what that means, that cut.
Thank you very much. This definitely means disruption of protection programs in fishing areas. This project was very, very important for women that are living within the fishing camps, and the women were selling sex for fish just for them to cater for their livelihoods. And the disruptions meant that the critical services we were providing for these women were disrupted, and currently these women have nothing to live on. And therefore, I think it's very important that as we are discussing funding for development, we consider the importance of social protection programming, especially for vulnerable women and girls, because then we are actually not talking about just survival. We are talking about equitable financing. We are talking about access to essential commodities and services, because sex for fish can actually increase vulnerability, but also gender-based violence, which we are saying in SDG 5 on gender equality, we want to improve the status quo of women and girls. And therefore, disruption such important programs actually entails that women and girls actually have a negative shift in terms of the empowerment process.
So just to be 100% clear, it means effectively that because that funding has been cut, women have no alternative, I suppose, than to offer sex to men in order to take those boats out to provide food for their family.
Yes, because for me, the alternatives would have been there if the US government had informed the Zambian government or partners well in advance, but they did not give us any options. The cut was done abruptly, and that was January, after December plans approved. And before we could actually begin to implement, we were told to stop implementation. And I think that's really unfortunate, because we live in a world where we need to plan. And so USAID cutting funds abruptly, I think, disrupted a number of things, not only the livelihoods of women, the livelihood support, but also programming in terms of how do we find alternatives to this. But nevertheless, we are actually working in ensuring that we find alternatives funding to continue with this program.
There are all sorts of other programs, aren't there? I mean, Zambia reported more than 42,000 gender-based violence cases in 2023, 2024. Those just the reported cases, of course. And all of those women and that support network now is either at risk or has already been cut.
Yes, and that's exactly what we mean, because with the cut entails that we have fewer protection services, we have fewer spaces available for women to get services from. It entails that there's a spike in the reports of gender-based violence, but also most importantly, the closure of women-led programs and self-shelters that will actually help the survivors of violence. And now they have nowhere to turn to. And this is why we are saying there's need for communication so that we actually plan for alternative measures for these women, because social protection is very important to women. It's not just it's not just a service, it's their rights. And so if we're going to talk about just equitable and fairness, it's important that we begin to consider the rights of women, but most importantly, the financing of women becomes a right for the women.
You talk about alternatives. I mean, are you able to provide alternatives with the money that you've got after those cuts from USAID? And has the conference there at all that you've been at been able to help come up with new ideas of how to finance these kind of projects?
We're actually engaging with bilateral donors, private foundations, and other partners to explore alternative funding sources. Of course, we need to have some emergency stopgap funds just to ensure that we close up the project, but also we ensure that we plan with the women on alternative sources. But definitely, we are working very closely with the programs, the local governments, and also communities to ensure that we build resilience and strengthen local systems. But also what we're trying to do is just to ensure that going forward, we have funding that is predictable, but also sustained, that will help at least build resilience and coping for the women as we continue with the implementation.
And the country is facing lots of other problems as well, not least a severe ongoing drought. That's threatening food security for 5.8 million people there.
Yes, we had experienced severe droughts in the 2023-2024 farming season. And we had actually an energy crisis in Zambia. And so looking at the funding, the funding gaps, plus the energy crisis that we are currently experiencing. We have not actually, we also experienced the floods in the 2024 season. We basically trying to improve our ways of lives, our ways of working, but most importantly, we are very optimistic that we will come over all these crises, especially that there is hope that our governments could look internally on domestic resource mobilization to sustain social protection programming.
And just time to ask you once again about that conference you're at the moment. I mean, have you heard anything there that might be able to help to try and alleviate these problems?
Of course, the negotiations are still going on. The conference closes today. We are pushing for a social protection agenda. We are also pushing for alternative financing for the countries in the global south. We are saying we need progressive taxation for countries to be able to resource. We need tax compliancy. But most importantly, I think the message that needs to go out is that when we talk about financing for development, we are talking about human beings. We are talking about human cost. It's not just numbers. And therefore, we need a human rights-based, gender-responsive narrative that speaks to the needs of the people of the countries in the global south if we have to attain the Vision 2030. Thank you.
Faides TembaTemba, thanks very much for being with us on the programme from ActionAid Zambia. They're joining us from that conference in Seville, the UN Conference on Financing and Development. Thanks very much.